Hello everybody, today we're going to talk about how and why you should read Jane Austen. It is important to approach these big authors, these canonical, classical authors, with a real sense of how do I read them, how do I wrangle them, because every author is different, every work is different, just like every person is different. There isn't one approach for everybody. You don't talk to everybody exactly the same. Our temperaments differ, our interests differ. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that every author is going to need a different tool set or skill set in approaching them. And I've got a lot of messages recently from either people enrolled in the Hardcore Literature Book Club or just generally saying that they cannot abide Austen. And hey, I sympathise. Austen isn't my personal go-to. Austen is perhaps the writer I've struggled most to comprehend, sympathise with and understand, and we are kind of in simpatico. And hey, perhaps it is a gender thing. Perhaps if I was born a woman, perhaps I would identify with some of what she's talking about even more. But we're going to get into that. We'll get into the gender thing, we'll get into the historical thing, but let's start by talking about the ironical thing or the satire thing. Now, the first thing to keep in mind when reading Austen is the fact that there's two types of readers who like Austen, and one likes Austen for, I'm going to say it, I'm not giving a moral judgment here, but one likes Austen for the right reason, and one likes Austen for the wrong reason. The wrong reason, and now I've coined the term, I believe, teacup drama, and there's that sense that you're watching something about frivolous gossip, and there's the type of reader that loves the drama and the gossip and the pettiness. That's not the right reader of Austen. Now, I'm all for a little bit of drama. I love a bit of drama myself now and then. It's entertaining. But Austen is deeply satirical, deeply ironical, and she's writing in a very wry, dry, sarcastic and pithy way most of the time. Her heroines are very sassy. By today's standards they're not, but for their time they were. They had a lot of vitality and verve and wit and vitalism, and they're brimming with life. Even the more subdued, seemingly passive and placid and easily persuadable characters like Anne Elliot, they end up being the most complex and vitalistic protagonists, not just in Austen's oeuvre, but in the entire oeuvre of English literature, and that includes Shakespeare, because Austen is deeply Shakespearean. Now, you're going to read Austen and keep an eye out for irony. And what does irony mean? Irony means you're saying something, but you mean something else. You don't mean what you say and you don't say what you mean. That's the art of Shakespeare. That's Hamlet all over. That's many of his characters. That's many of his great female protagonists and heroines. Look out for irony, because very often Austen is making really wry, astute, nuanced social observations and commentaries. She's there with you, looking askance at what's going on, kind of like, are you seeing what I'm seeing as well? If you're really perceptive and you approach her work in a sense of stillness and bring yourself with reverence to her work, you'll pick up on it. It's the same with Turgenev. We read a story by Ivan Turgenev recently in the book club, The Live Relic. We're going to read 3 more, and we're also going to read Chekhov very soon. Now, the thing about Turgenev, people find him boring. Ostensibly on the surface nothing happens, but if you bring yourself to the story in a position and a place of quiet contemplation and reflection, you see beneath the veil or behind the curtain, you see the magic, the quiet magic of everyday life, and it's wonderful. So sometimes with Austen, you just need a little bit of stillness to reconnect with the first reader. In every one of us there is a first reader, and that first reader is not us in this lifetime. That first reader is the reader of Austen's time. Now, she was relatively successful publishing under a male pseudonym, getting her brother to publish her works. But of course, as you probably know, a lot of her stories were posthumous. They were published after her death, and Persuasion, the book that we're reading in the book club, that is her late melancholic autumnal masterpiece, written when she was ill and published a few months after she sadly passed away. Now, you got to understand, when you're reading Austen, you are reading something that was remarkable for the first time. It's the same when you read Fielding, like Tom Jones, or you read Pamela by Samuel Richardson. These writers were on the cusp They were at the rise of the novel, so they were doing things that set the groundwork for novelists to come after them. By the time we get to Joyce is doing loads of interesting things that breaks the novel, essentially, but it's not anything that wasn't already kind of done before. Playing around with time was done in Tristram Shandy. Now, the thing that was interesting about Austen was, up until her point, you couldn't find a novel that was a blend of psychologically complex characters and a riveting story. It was like a one or the other, either or. There were gothic romances, there were ballads, there was journalistic pieces, there were folk songs and folk stories and myths and legends, but there wasn't anything like Austen. And so the novel form in Austen's time was denigrated. If you look at Northanger Abbey, that's kind of like her ode to the novel form, giving it more respect. And really, like, we'll probably look into Northanger Abbey a little bit, because it was published simultaneously in the same volume with Persuasion when it first came out, and it has a lot of her comments on the novel. Jane Austen pioneered the novel form, so when you read stories today, you're reading Austen, and that's why people overlook her, or they might think she's boring. Okay, now I'm just going to say it outright. Many traditionally masculine guys cannot abide Austen. Now, I'm thinking of the guy who is a Hemingway fan, a guy who is drawn to, for example, modern novels like Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho, for example, a guy who will read, I don't know, Chuck Palahniuk, someone who, even people who get a lot out of Anna Karenina, which is like the best teacup drama of all time, will find it a struggle to abide Austen, even though Austen endlessly influenced not just the French novelists, but the Russians. When you're reading Tolstoy and marvelling at him, you're reading Austen. And when Anna Karenina is reading a book on the train and it's an English novel, it's either Trollope, maybe Dickens, but it's probably Austen. So a good hack, and this is not just for Austen, but this is for any sort of classical work that you're struggling to comprehend. Firstly, slow well down, and question what you're reading on a sentence level. Ask yourself, what is being said? Is it actually straightforward, or is there something beneath the surface? We go back to Hemingway. If you read a story like Hills Like White Elephants, there is so much beneath the surface. It's ellipsis. It is ironical. So in one aspect, we are used to it, and I believe Hemingway would have been influenced by Austen, or would have been influenced by those who were influenced by Austen. It's like the Shakespeare conundrum. You can't shake off his influence. He's always going to influence you one way or another, because you're always reading him, even if you're not overtly reading him. It's the same with Austen. So slow down, ask yourself, is there more that's not being said? And that's a wonderful art. Along with metaphor being the highest mode of thought, according to Aristotle, is this idea of irony. Irony is really complex, it's difficult to comprehend, it's taxing, but if you can wrangle irony, you can think really high-level abstract thoughts, and you can sharpen your skills of empathy and human understanding like never before. So, slow down, ask yourself, is this satirical, is this ironical? What does Jane really think about this? And Jane does imbue herself, not only in the characters, but she's there as an omnipresent, but very subtle presence in the world. That's another thing that she did. We'll talk about narrative in the book club when we go through Persuasion, because she pioneered some great narrative techniques as well. But also think about the first reader, okay? So there weren't that many books being published at the time. There was suddenly an influx of female readers for the first time in history. There was suddenly an influx of working class readers. So typically maids and servants, they had more time on their hands than others. They would wait around in between serving their masters some meals and stuff like that, and they would read the book by candlelight. They'd pay whatever it was, pennies, shillings, whatever the cost was, and they'd get them in cheap volumes. Suddenly, when you're reading Austen, you're reading a period of time in which the novel form was suddenly open and more accessible, not just to the aristocracy or the gentry. Suddenly, it was becoming more mainstream. You have libraries, lending libraries, and they would thrive on these really soap opera-esque teacup dramas, like Samuel Richardson's Pamela and Clarissa, and then Jane Austen. So put yourself in the position of the first reader, because if you're a first reader, it's remarkable. Imagine there's no such thing as television. There's no such thing as high-speed internet. The village that you're brought up in is the village that you're going to die in, and you're probably not going to know more than 100 people over the course of your lifetime. In that regard, these books are fascinating. Yeah, a little trip from London to Bath to Lyme Regis and back again is going to be filled with wonder and splendour when you're reading it as a vicarious experience. So that's something to do as well. Be on the lookout for satire, irony, and connect with the first reader deep inside you. We all have one. And connect with the other as well. I'm talking to guys because I am a guy, and I'm talking to those people who are resistant to Austen, and very typically they might look a little bit like myself, or they might look a little bit older, but it really is, Austen is, unfortunately she's been tarnished as being like a female or a girl writer, just in the same way as Hemingway is like a boy writer, and I think that's unfair to both, because both writers can teach us not only things about human nature generally, wider, how we interact with ourselves and others in the world, but it really offers us such insight. If you're a man, it offers us such insight into the nuance of thought of women. You can understand women more by reading Austen. No wonder she pioneered and spearheaded the women's literature movement. It's the same with anything, and that's the beauty of these books, is that we can live 1,000 lifetimes in one. When we read Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, tremendous. We're suddenly part of the war generation, but not just the war generation, a Soviet era generation, and we can understand that. When we read James Baldwin, Richard Wright, we're connecting with, if we're straight, we're connecting with homosexuality. If we're white, we're connecting with black writers. It's the same with Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison, with a bit of furore, has basically said that her books are not for certain people. They are for a very specific demographic. I personally don't buy into identity politics. I think when you read books like Song of Solomon, you're afforded a splendid opportunity to connect with somebody who ultimately is like you and has the same fears and wants and wishes and dreams and aspirations, but doesn't look like you or wasn't raised in the same culture as you. And I think that's endlessly fascinating. And we can really learn so much from people who are different from us by identifying what remains the same and what remains constant across time and across identity. But we're not going to read Austen through a primarily identity-based lens in the book club. We're going to read it through a very eminently humanistic lens, and we're going to have a lot of fun and we're going to learn a lot. So I hope to see you in there. The book club is kicking off Persuasion very, very soon. At time of recording, we're just finishing up Crime and Punishment, but the book club's completely self-paced, so you can join whenever. And we've just recently released some merch. I'll drop a link to the store down below, but we've kicked off with some mugs, and I helped design these. I enlisted the support of a very talented designer, and we've got a series of mugs here. This one's filled with butter coffee with coconut in it. It's delicious. But on one side, in the Great Authors series, you've got the author, and Proust here is in a deep royal blue to match the everyman. We've got Austen in green, we've got Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, we've got some poets, and on the other side you've got a choice quote, one of my favourite ones. This one is, "Our social personalities are a creation of the thoughts of other people." So check it out if you're in the market for a mug, and we've got some like t-shirts and book bags and journals coming out soon as well. But anyway, hope you enjoy Austen, whether you're naturally drawn to her or not. I'm going to help you either way. Cheers.